Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 19th Annual Gus and Libby Solomon Memorial Lecture. My name is Natan Meir. I'm the Academic Director of the Harold Schnitzer Family Program in Judaic Studies. I'm going to start tonight by with a little piece of bureaucracy by reading PSU's Statement on Disruptions. This event was scheduled and organized by the Harold Schnitzer Family Program in Judaic Studies. We expect all attendees to conduct themselves in such a way that the program is not disrupted. A disruption is conduct that interferes with the speaker's ability to conduct the scheduled event, or interference that blocks the audience from seeing, hearing, or participating in the event. If an attendee behaves in such a way that prevents audience members from hearing, seeing, or participating in the scheduled event, they may be asked to stop or to leave the event. End of statement. And now for the real start. Tonight I begin by expressing my sincere gratitude to Dick Solomon and Elise Flitcraft, the sponsors of this event. This lecture series honors the memory of Dick's parents, Gus and Libby Solomon. Gus and Libby were leaders and visionaries for the Jewish community and for Portland as a whole. Today is the 36th anniversary of Gus Solomon's death. And I'm going to go off script for a second. I received tonight a beautiful book of poetry and stories by Libby Solomon. And the first poem is called Gus. It was written in 1994. You lie in the earth for 7 years. I hope in peace. The turmoil and injustices are yours no more. You did your best to right injustice. Your students still speak of you in awe, in respectful remembrance. I carry on in my way. I am not ready yet to join you, to lie in the earth. But if it is my time, so be it. The good you did lives on. Lie in peace and loving remembrance. I don't think I need to add anything to that. Gus served as federal judge in Oregon for an impressive 39 years, making him the longest-serving judge in the state's history. Libby, meanwhile, was a passionate civil rights activist. Together, they were champions for civil rights and liberties, tirelessly fighting against anti-Semitism and other forms of prejudice. Libby also played a pivotal role in founding our Judaic Studies program here at PSU. We are incredibly grateful to Dick and Elise for their characteristic humility and generosity. Through this annual event and in many other ways, they ensure that Gus and Libby's legacy continues to inspire future generations. We're deeply appreciative of their friendship and unwavering support for our department. I also want to thank our co-sponsors for this evening's lecture, the Oregon Jewish Community Foundation, the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and PSU's Department of History, PDX Hillel, the Jewish Student Union, and Chai Cultural and Historical Association for Israel. Now I'd like to ask President Ann Cudd to offer some words of welcome. President Cudd arrived on campus, as many of you know, last August with tons of energy and new ideas, and has been busy since then doing a lot of listening and offering an exciting new vision of leadership for PSU. And I'm honored that she's with us tonight.
Thank you, Natan. It's wonderful to be here. Good evening and welcome, everyone, to the 19th Annual Gus and Libby Solomon Memorial Lecture, a long and treasured tradition in the life of the Harold Schnitzer Family Program in Judaic Studies here at Portland State. PSU's Judaic Studies program takes the 3,000-year-long history and culture of the Jews as a framework for grappling with urgent human questions about justice and knowledge, tradition and change, and crisis and resilience. We are all aware that this year especially, our gathering together for this lecture and the conversations it will spur feels more vital than ever. As we watch with sadness the human tragedies that have unfolded in the Middle East since October 7th, many in our PSU community are in pain and passions are understandably high. I have worked to make it clear that we cannot tolerate hate or violence of any kind on our campus, and we must stand up to combat acts of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and all related biases. PSU is a place where everyone belongs, and everyone is worthy of respect. And we must be committed to learning more about ourselves and each other. This is our only path forward as a diverse, urban-serving institution. To facilitate this work, I've commissioned the Building Community Through Dialogue Task Force, which is engaged in the urgent work of fostering community and making space for productive conversation in the face of divisive and heartbreaking conflict. It is imperative to me that we spend time working to ensure that every student, faculty, and staff member can feel safe on this campus, and I believe that we can do that while also protecting free speech and academic freedom. Indeed, our future as an academic institution demands that we do so. It's not easy work. In fact, it's one of several challenges faced by Portland State. But as a new president and a new Portlander, and I've been on the job now for 199 days, I'm extremely optimistic, both about the will of our community to face tough challenges and about the impact that PSU can have on our wider city. PSU is currently engaged in a strategic planning process designed to guide us through the end of this decade and answer the question, what does the future need from Portland State University? Our process includes many community stakeholders, including members of the Judaic Studies Program's Advisory Committee. I welcome any and all input as we answer that important question and envision our collective future. Thank you again for being here tonight and for engaging in productive dialogue with Portland State.
Thank you, President Cudd. Now I'd like to ask Interim Provost Shelley Shaban to say a few words of welcome. After providing thoughtful and dedicated leadership in a number of positions at PSU over the past decade, including Associate Dean in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and Vice Provost for Academic Personnel and Leadership Development, Dr. Shaban was named by President Cudd last summer to serve as Interim Provost. And for those of you who aren't familiar with university leadership positions, the provost is the vice president responsible for the academic affairs of the university, which is, in other words, the core function of the institution. Shelley, thank you for being here with us tonight.
Thank you, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the 19th Annual Gus and Libby Solomon Memorial Lecture. There will be a quiz after this, so remember, 19. You've heard it a few times, but it's important. My heartfelt gratitude to Dick Solomon and Elise Flitcraft for forging and fostering communications through events like this one. I also want to thank Dr. Natan Meyer. He has, from the beginning of the Judaic Studies program, and in particular over these last few months of unrest, proven himself to be a devoted leader who demonstrates authenticity and vulnerability. Since October 7th, Natan has convened gatherings and created physical and emotional space for members of the community, and consistently and courageously invited and responded to questions and concerns. I have been a Judaic Studies Advisory Board member for many years, and I have watched this program evolve to a position of relevance and value on the campus and throughout the region. I can attest to the program's deep roots in the community and the extent to which it is in turn bolstered and sustained by community members who audit courses, mentor students, volunteer with the program, contribute ideas, time, and financial support, and attend events such as this one. Community seems more important now than ever. This is a time when we need to know there are individuals we can lean on for support, people who care, people who understand. And this community has and continues to pull people in, even during these complicated and difficult times. This is the true system of mitzvah. In these last months, I've reflected on my own Jewish experience growing up in New York and the Yiddish my maternal grandparents, my Baba and Zeta, would use. Both spoke Yiddish, and although I did not appreciate it at the time, this language was a way to identify and nurture our family and our community. Yiddish terms are not easily translatable to English, and I don't know the Yiddish word for community, but I will never forget the word mishpacha, or family. Mishpacha means more than your immediate relatives by blood. Indeed, tonight we come together as mishpacha to celebrate, to learn, and to hope for unity and harmony. I've got one more page here. With affection and appreciation to Natan and the Judaic Studies faculty, to President Cudd, to my beloved PSU, to the Solomons, and to this community, my mishpacha. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelley. I really appreciate those words. They mean a lot to me. Okay, I would like you, this is where I ask for money. I would like you all to consider making a donation to support tonight's event or our Judaic Studies program more generally. Many of you here tonight are already supporters of the Judaic Studies program, and we're very grateful for your continuing support. If you're not a supporter, please consider that it does take resources to offer free events such as these to the public, and we would welcome you as partners in our range of academic and programmatic initiatives. I also want to give a heartfelt thanks to the people who have been on our staff, who have been working for months to make sure this event goes smoothly. Suzanne Van Amberg, Vicky Mazzone, Claire Warren, and Luda Bickwinknell. They are here somewhere, and I'm very, very grateful to them. I'm now pleased to call upon my colleague, Nina Spiegel, the Rabbi Joshua Stamfer Professor of Israel Studies, to introduce our speaker tonight.
Welcome, everyone. It is my great honor and privilege this evening to introduce to you Dr. David Myers. Professor Myers is a distinguished leader in the field of Jewish studies and a scholar who has combined his academic interests with public service pursuits, working tirelessly to bring his vast academic knowledge to serve both at the university and in the community at large. His outstanding research focuses on a wide range of topics, ranging from, among others, the history of Zionism, American Jewish life, modern Jewish intellectual history, and the intersection of history and memory. He has authored 6 books, such as Jewish History, A Very Short Introduction, and The Stakes of History on the Use and Abuse of Jewish History for Life, and edited or co-edited an additional 12 books. As part of his efforts to serve the community, Professor Myers has served as the president CEO of the Center for Jewish History in New York and as board president of the New Israel Fund. Before I continue to enumerate several of his many accomplishments, I want to first share some personal stories. I first met David when I was applying to graduate school in modern Jewish history and dance history. I discussed the possibility of UCLA with him, and I always thought it would be a great experience to have the opportunity to work with him. But I ultimately decided that I needed to leave my hometown for my grad school experience. Though during my grad school years at Stanford and beyond, David served as an unofficial mentor, always ready to provide me with invaluable advice. I often actually wish that I had stayed in LA and studied with him. I found that most scholars at the time of David's stature and expertise in intellectual history looked down upon an interest in dance and popular culture, but not David. He always stood out for his open-mindedness and acceptance of different research pathways, and I have been so grateful for his support. His many students over the years, too, have benefited from his generosity of spirit. Now, as it happens, a few years before I came to PSU, David invited me to give a keynote address at UCLA on the history of dance in Israel to kick off a month-long residency that they were having with Israeli choreographers. This experience was incredibly impactful because while I was at UCLA, I attended rehearsals and informally interviewed all three of the choreographers, one of whom was Idan Cohen. This then connected to my first year at PSU when I brought Idan Cohen here for a one-week artistic residency. And thus, in us now bringing David to speak at PSU, I believe that we have come full circle. David Myers is the Distinguished Professor of History and holds the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History at UCLA, where he serves as the director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. He also directs the UCLA Initiative to Study Hate. Of his numerous books that he has written and edited, one that he wrote with Nomi Stolzenberg, American Shtetl, The Making of Kiryas Yoel, a Hasidic village in upstate New York, was awarded the 2022 National Jewish Book Award in American Jewish Studies. He will be speaking this evening on Will Zion Be Redeemed by Justice? Shifting Attitudes Toward Israel Among U.S. Jews. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Myers.
Wow. I generally really detest long introductions, but I have to say that was particularly tolerable, because it really compelled me to think back to those times when you were a junior scholar trying to figure out how to fuse those two seemingly divergent paths, which actually, as you discovered, merged together so beautifully in your work. And it really is a source of great gratification to see you flourishing in such a special institution as PSU. So I'm really delighted that you evoked such rich memories. I'm really delighted to be here with you. It's been a great few hours. I want to begin by thanking my indefatigable host, Professor Natan Meir, who so graciously invited and welcomed me here. Vicky Mazzone and the team, thank you so much for all you did to make my landing a peaceful one, and my few hours so far really delightful. And of course, to Dick and Elise, thank you for the inspired generosity that enabled this really important lecture series, which, as we can see, resonates with the institution and beyond. When Natan asked me for a title for this talk, I responded on October 4th, 2023, by proposing, Will Zion Be Redeemed by Justice? Shifting Attitudes Towards Israel Among U.S. Jews. What I had in mind then was the way in which Israel had become a kind of Rorschach test for Jews in the United States, especially with regard to the question of justice. And by that I mean the way in which different groups of Jews look at Israel through the lens of justice and see very different images. For some, Israel was and is a paragon of morality in a world of malign actors. And for others, Israel was and is a source of injustice, principally with respect to Palestinians. Anyway, that's what I had planned to do on October 4th. Then October 7th occurred. And I wondered in the days and weeks after whether such a talk would be suitable. On October 19th, I wrote back to Natan to give a brief summary of the talk I planned to give. And I not only retained that original language, but added a reference to October 7th. So since it was written, I decided to move ahead and actually try and work it out. And that's really what I'm doing before you tonight, working out some thoughts. As I reconstruct my thinking then, I postulated that the question of justice remained an important one, perhaps more important than ever, not just or principally in moral terms, but as a wedge issue that divided people and Jews, especially generationally. So what I'm referring to is that split screen image of the brutal Hamas orchestrated massacre of Israelis and the devastation visited upon Gazans by the Israeli military campaign. These provide material for radically divergent views of Israel in the United States at large and within the Jewish population in particular. Now, the literary touchstone for the talk tonight is a well-known verse from the book of Isaiah, chapter 1, verse 27, Tzion b'mishpat tipadeh. Zion will be redeemed in justice, or alternatively, you will see it translated as judgment, which the great medieval commentators, and here I'm thinking of Rashi, the great Ashkenazi biblical commentator, and Avraham ibn Ezra, the great Sephardi biblical commentator, they understood similar terms. Zion will be redeemed, Rashi writes, since there will be in it people who practice justice. Ibn Ezra notes for his part that Zion will, in consequence of her justice, be redeemed. The association between Zion and justice, and here it's important to note the word used is not what we might think, tzedek, but mishpat, is firmly established in the minds of medievals, who suggest that the redemption of Zion will come about because of the justice of those who inhabit it, or because of the justice that issues from its special properties, as if its terrain lends itself to justice. So tonight, I'd like to examine the association between Zion and justice, and I'll do so by surveying 4 different stages in the relationship between Jews in the United States and the Zionist project and state of Israel. At the outset, it's important to note there's no single Zionism or Israel, but multiple varieties, and no single American Jewry, but various iterations. But having said that, what I want to argue is that the relationship between Jews in the United States and Zionism and the state of Israel reveals over almost a century and a half a pair of constantly recurring countervailing vectors. On one hand, an ongoing process by which Zion and Israel have taken root in the American Jewish imagination. In more recent times, a process by which Israelism has become, in a certain way, the civil religion of Jews in the United States. By which I mean that Israeli-related culture and Hebrew language acquisition have become the foundations of formal and informal Jewish education. And in concert with this trend, commitment to the state of Israel is, for many, the raison d'etre, certainly for many of the major Jewish organizations that populate the institutional landscape of American Jewry. It's no surprise then that many Jews feel a strong sense of identity with Israel. In the 2013 Pew Research Survey, nearly 70% of American Jews declared that they feel somewhat or very attached to Israel. And we'll discuss the later 2020 survey in a few minutes. On the other hand, each of the 4 eras that I want to review with you reveals deep divisions and dissenting currents over the meaning, the virtue, and the utility of Zionism in the state of Israel. And what about the world after October 7th? It strikes me that what we see is an intensification of the very trends that I've just articulated. At once, greater solidarity with Israel and with its predicament, and at the same time, more overt public expression of non-Zionist and anti-Zionist views than we have seen for a long time, at least for a century or so. I'm thinking back to a time in the early 20th century when there were vigorous debates between Zionists and anti-Zionists, oftentimes both nationalists of different varieties. A key question that I want to pose is whether the fracturing over Israel, especially after October 7th, will lead to irreparable division, or whether perhaps there can be a reordering of the American Jewish conversation in ways that include the perspectives and interests, especially of a younger generation of American Jews. I want to also point out that this is a very consequential moment in the relationship between Jews in the United States and Israel itself, in one very important regard. The two groups of Jews have reached a state of near demographic parity, with approximately 7 million in each. The figure in the United States ranges, demographers disagree, from 6.3 million to 7.8 million. In Israel, we know a little bit more precisely, it's about 7.2 million. Both groups are experiencing population growth, which challenges the narrative of decline and fear that so often informs conversations about Jewish life, especially in the diaspora. Modern Jews have often regarded themselves as the last link in a long historical chain, prompting, thank you, I'll put it right under here, prompting the great Jewish thinker, someone whom I've devoted a good portion of my own scholarship to, a man by the name of Simon Ravidovich, to call the Jews an ever-dying people, a group that insists that each generation will be the last. Past historical patterns demonstrate that when faced with anxiety over survival from either an internal threat, such as assimilation, or an external threat, such as anti-Semitism, Jews have responded with newfound energy to forge new institutional frameworks and self-definitions. This has been a recurrent trend in the modern Jewish experience. And it reflects a substantial measure of resilience and creativity that I think is a time-tested feature of really the remarkable adaptive mechanism of the Jews. I mean, the question that ultimately lies at the heart of my pursuit is, how did this small, beleaguered group manage to survive? Right? One could say divine intervention is the obvious answer, but as a practicing historian, that's typically not the one I conjure up. Something about this remarkable adaptive mechanism that we can talk about later. So I come tonight not to declare the end of Jewish history, but rather to play out some of the potential responses and outcomes to the latest crisis to befall the Jews, especially with regard to the relationship of American Jews to Israel. So with that, let me now jump into the matter at hand by offering up this rather schematic periodization of 4 eras in the relationship between Jews and the United States and Zionism, and then later the State of Israel. First period that I want to talk about extends, in my very idiosyncratic periodization, I will be the first to admit, from 1885 to 1948. And it reflects the shift of Jews in the United States away from a stance of quite clear anti-Zionism towards something else. And the anti-Zionism is rooted in an important document, an important text from 1885, formulated by the Reform Movement in Pittsburgh, from which President Codd comes, called the Pittsburgh Platform. It was a platform that articulated the vision of the American Reform Movement in the late 19th century. Its 5th plank said, "We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine, nor a sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state." That, I would say, is a pretty clear instance of anti-Zionism avant la lettre, because Zionism, the term, hadn't actually come into play. It would take another 7 years or so. But a year before the Pittsburgh Platform, an important proto-Zionist thinker by the name of Leon Pinsker convened the founding conference of a group called Chibat Zion, Love of Zion, in the year 1884. Lovers of Zion who were committed to, in fact, reviving the Jewish nation and commencing a process of return, as they understood it, of Jews to the ancestral homeland. So that stands at odds with the vision of the Pittsburgh Platform. We also should note that at that very point in time, following the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881, we see new migratory streams of Jews making their way, as Chibat Zion suggested, to Palestine, but also far more statistically significant to the Americas and the United States. Immigrants from Eastern Europe, Yiddish-speaking, both more traditional in their religious observance and more untraditional in their commitment to socialism. Both groups make their way to the United States. Both groups have a measure of distance from the emerging Zionist project. Traditionally observant Jews resisted because they saw it as an anti-religious movement that sought to arrogate to itself a divine prerogative, namely the process by which Jews would be restored to their ancestral homeland. And yet, the United States, even in that period, was big enough and dynamic enough for a Zionist movement to take rise. A turning point came during and after the First World War, when Jews in Eastern Europe were subjected to discrimination, to displacement, and even, as occurred in Ukraine in 1918-19, to mass murder. We often forget that 100,000 Jews were killed in Ukraine in the most brutal fashion in 1918, 1919, as sort of the map of Europe was being carved up and new nation states were emerging out of the husks of once vibrant multi-ethnic empires. In this period, the American Zionist movement grew considerably, reaching 200,000 members in 1917. Perhaps its most renowned spokesman was Louis Brandeis, the distinguished lawyer and Supreme Court justice, who harmonized his American, Jewish, and Zionist commitments in this famous syllogism. To be good Americans, we must be better Jews. And to be better Jews, we must become Zionists. To be sure, many American Jews did not heed Brandeis's call, did not join the Zionist movement at this point. Either they saw the US as a country in which it was possible and necessary to struggle for equality in line with, for example, Emma Lazarus' famous poem, The New Colossus, with its call, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free," or they saw their main mission in America as accommodating and integrating into their new homeland without raising the specter of dual loyalty that Zionism might induce. This latter task was articulated clearly in a second manifesto of the Reform movement, known as the Columbus Platform from 1937. It declared, "In all lands where our people live, they assume and seek to share loyally the full duties and responsibilities of citizenship and to create seats of Jewish knowledge and religion." The ideal of integration. But significantly, the rabbis who assembled at Columbus were mindful both of the growing Zionist movement and, of course, of the darkening clouds over Europe since the time of the ascension of Adolf Hitler to power in 1933. And so in a major shift from the past, they proclaimed now in the Columbus Platform, quote, "In the rehabilitation of Palestine, the land hallowed by memories and hopes, we behold the promise of renewed life for many of our brethren. We affirm the obligation of all Jewry to aid in its upbuilding as a Jewish homeland by endeavoring to make it not only a haven of refuge for the oppressed, but also a center of Jewish cultural and spiritual life." To be sure, this was not a call for American Jews to make Aliyah themselves, to immigrate to Palestine, but rather to imagine Zionism as a solution for those most in need of a safe space to live, European and specifically Eastern European Jews. Exigencies in Europe following the beginning of the war in 1939 hastened a growing accommodation among American Jews to the goals of Zionism. That's a process that continues from the Columbus platform up to the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, but not for all, because this is what this kind of pendulous movement of one vector and its opposite really reveals in our survey. For example, there was a dissident group of Reform rabbis, those who did not appreciate that language in the Columbus platform, who banded together in 1942 to establish the American Council for Judaism, which reaffirmed Reform Jewry's longstanding opposition to Zionism by claiming that Jewish nationalism tends to confuse our fellow men about our place and function in society and diverts our own attention from our historic role to live as a religious community wherever we may dwell. I should add that a similar ethos was expressed by the circles of Haredi, or ultra-Orthodox Jews, who survived the Holocaust and came to the United States after the Second World War. For them, it was a paramount religious and moral obligation to heed the edicts of the sovereign where they lived, consistent with the ancient principle of Dina di Malchuta Dina, the law of the kingdom is the law. And this meant resisting all efforts by the Zionist movement to encourage Jews to return to Palestine. But as I've hinted, over the course of the 1940s, this stance of resistance would be a minority voice as conditions worsened in Europe and the logic of a place of refuge became more evident. American Zionists in this very period held a conference in May 1942 at the Biltmore Hotel in New York that gave voice to the principle that Palestine should become not just a safe haven, but the site of a Jewish commonwealth, replete with sovereign authority and open to all Jews. Even as those dissenting voices remained, the pendulum of American Jewish public identity was shifting toward greater acceptance of Zionism, propelled by reports from Europe of the attempted extermination of that continent's Jewish population. And so, when the United Nations General Assembly in late November 1947 voted to partition Palestine into two states, one of which would be a Jewish state, there was relief and joy in the United States and amongst Jews here that a homeland for beleaguered people had been found, and significantly, that a measure of justice had been restored following the Holocaust. Zionism achieved a new measure of legitimacy here, now that the State of Israel had been created. The non-Zionists, as they call them themselves, of the American Jewish Committee, came to terms with the new reality, as reflected in the famous agreement between the first Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, and the president of the American Jewish American Jewish Committee, Jacob Blaustein. It's important to note, and here I rely on some very significant new scholarship, thinking particularly of Jeffrey Levine's new book called Our Palestine Questions, that there was a curious alliance in this period between or among anti-Zionists, left-wing Zionists, and the old non-Zionists of the American Jewish Committee, who focused attention in the late 1940s, the early 1950s, on the fate of Palestinians who fled or were forced from the land in the 1948 war. So for those people as well, the question of justice was very present. Didn't obviate necessarily for all of them their commitment to Zionism, but the question of justice had another dimension in their concern for the fate of Palestinians. 1948 marks the end of one period and the beginning of a subsequent period that extends from 1948 to 1967. And here too we see competing currents as in the earlier phase. Especially pronounced are a number of distinct trends related to the overall theme of this talk. And I want to mention three of them. First, we see an ongoing appetite by Jews in America for integration. Jews of the first and second generation, whose goal, as Philip Roth observed so caustically in Goodbye Columbus, was to achieve a comfortable middle-class, suburban, and emphatically American way of life. Located within that drive for middle-class respectability, though also pushing against it, was a second trend by which American Jewish political activists joined the emerging civil rights movement, which they saw as consistent with their own sense of Jewish justice. As Rabbi Jacob Rothschild of Atlanta stated in 1963, we are involved because our religious heritage has led us to a concept of morality, which democracy has taken as its own. And it's important to note that I think it was 6 years earlier, Rabbi Rothschild's synagogue was attacked, was the victim of a bombing attack, as we assume as a result of his activism. Though it's important to observe, as the scholar Mark Dollinger does in his book, Black Power, Jewish Politics, that the Jewish activists who involved themselves in the civil rights movement were mindful, they were aware that there are real limits to the kind of liberal activism that they espoused, that such activism would not completely undo the structural inequity in this country, especially with respect to its Black population. So these two developments, the growing accommodation and the emergence of a kind of middle-class activism within American Jewry, proceeded alongside a third development, which is the growing institutionalization of support for the State of Israel, which I think reflected a growing comfort on the part of American Jews in their own participation in the American political system. They sort of understood that in order to advance one's goals, one had to play the game of interest group politics. And so a number of organizations took rise in this period that would emerge as extremely significant in regulating the relations between American Jews and Israel. The first is AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Council, which was founded in 1953 as the American Zionist Committee for Public Affairs, founded by a good liberal Jew named Cy Kennan, who was deeply committed to the Zionist cause and the State of Israel. And it's important to note that the council took rise around the time that there was a kind of eyesore source of real public attention and embarrassment in Israel. And I'm referring to the attack by the Israel Defense Forces in the Palestinian town of Kibbutz in October 1953, in which some 70 people were killed. This followed a Palestinian terrorist attack that killed a Jewish mother and her 2 children in the town of Yehud. This was one of the first instances in which this newly formed Zionist Committee for Public Affairs was able to offer sort of an alternative explanation to that which had been found in the media. But as this new council takes form, it's important to note that the Eisenhower administration had a measure of skepticism about it. They feared that it might be funded by the Israeli government in order to advance Israeli propaganda. And this was at a time when the United States was not yet the dominant military ally of Israel. But nonetheless, the creation of this council reflects, I think, a growing comfort and a growing realization that in order to advance communal goals, you had to participate in the political process. The second organization that was established in 1955 was the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, which served as an umbrella for a wide range of groups and institutions across the denominational and political spectrum. These two organizations emerged over the course of a quarter century as main anchors in expressing the deep political, financial, and emotional bond that American Jews, and for that matter, American political figures, developed with Israel. And I think that those two developments actually belong to a larger American development, which is the process of institutionalizing Jewish identity and life in America. So for example, between the years 1945 and 1965, 1,000 new synagogues were built in this country. And the number of students in Jewish educational institutions doubled just in the decade between 1948 and 1958. So the 1950s feature a process of substantial institutionalization of American Judaism and Jewish culture, whereas the next decade witnessed a related but quite distinct phenomenon. I would call it an intensified process of Israelization of Jewish identity and culture, especially after the Six-Day War. The Six Days War, when Israel undertook a lightning strike against its chief Arab foes, Egypt and Syria, whose air forces were wiped out in a matter of hours, and in the course of which Israel undertook very substantial territorial conquests in the West Bank, Gaza, Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. 1967 inaugurates a third period in the history I'm narrating that extends, we could choose various options, but I'm going to say up to 2014. It had a hugely galvanizing impact on Jews in this country, unleashing for many really a new degree of ethnic pride in their Jewishness. And was a new particularism that wasn't just born of 67, of the Six Days War, but also of a sensibility that was taking rise in American culture more generally of sort of isolation, separation, segregation in the name of cultural particularism, such as we saw in the Black Power movement and in the ethnic pride movement of the late 60s and early 70s. Jews felt in this moment that the war clarified the question on whose side justice stood. And this view was widely held in America, not just among Jews. In a Harris poll from June 1967, 50% of American Jews registered sympathy with Israel, and none registered sympathy with the Arab side. 50% sat it out. It was 50 on one side, almost zero on the other. The new ethnic pride pushed forward a new kind of connection to Israel. And it was no longer constrained by fears of the old charge of dual loyalty. It rested on the belief, as one very keen observer, political scientist, Daniel Elazar stated, that the Jewish fate is now bound up with the political entity that is the State of Israel. That new pride and unity coincided with an ever-expanding network of American Jewish institutions for which Israel was the chief source of inspiration and object of affection. But as we know, unity is a very ephemeral thing. Soon enough, divisions emerged, not all that surprising amongst Jews. In 1973, a group of rabbis and scholars took rise and organized themselves in opposition to Israel's occupation of the territories conquered in 1967. And they called for a two-state solution, very radical idea in 1973. They named themselves Brera, which means choice or alternative. And they maintained that there were credible alternatives to the current Israeli policy, namely territorial concessions and the realization of Palestinian self-determination. This group was short-lived. It only lasted until 1977. But it anticipates a more critical moment in the history of relations between Israel and American Jewry. And I'm thinking particularly of the First Lebanon War of 1982, when Israel responded to an attempted assassination on one of its diplomats by moving its forces into southern Lebanon and eventually all the way to Beirut. This was, in the eyes of many Israelis, a war of choice, not an obligatory war. And they felt it marked a very dangerous turn for Israel, especially after the massacre perpetrated by Israel's Christian allies in a Palestinian refugee camp called Sabra Shatila from September 16th to 18th, 1982. A week later, quite remarkably, on September 25th, 1982, 400,000 Israelis, representing 1/10 of the country gathered together in protest. And I remember it very well because I was there as a young graduate student. The force of the protests in Israel reverberated beyond that country, and it reached Jews throughout the diaspora in very significant ways. One prominent American writer, Mark Halperin, wrote in a New York Times op-ed from November 1982, after decades of diplomatic reticence, many American Jews have tentatively broken their silence and criticized Israel, speaking for the first time not just to the United States on behalf of Israel, but to Israel on behalf of the United States. So the Lebanon War, I think, was a key moment in legitimizing overt criticism of Israel by Jews who didn't live there. By contrast, of course, there were those who said, maintained, and still do, that it's not permissible for Jews who do not live in Israel to criticize it, since they do not bear the responsibility of defending it with their own lives. Quite public divisions, no longer consigned to back rooms, became normal in this period and continued into the 1990s, the Oslo era, the era of the Oslo peace process. And then following its collapse into the Second Palestinian Uprising, or Intifada, which gave a rather inglorious burial to what seemed so promising in the 1990s. Who can forget that memorable scene on the White House lawn when President Bill Clinton physically brought together Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat to shake hands. So the Second Intifada of 2000 brings to an end that moment of hope. And it led many Israeli Jews to really surrender their earlier commitment to reconciliation with Palestinians for a new belief in what they saw as their enemies' unquenchable thirst for genocide. For its part, the American Jewish establishment, by which I mean that kind of dizzying alphabet soup of organizations, the AJC, the ADL, AIPAC, lined up in strong support of Israel, which was now engaged in the midst of the Second Intifada in a brutal conflict with Palestinians in the West Bank as well as in Israel. So on one hand, we have this new solidarity with Israel. On the other hand, there was a steady stream of Jewish voices in the United States, emboldened by 1982, who criticized the occupation of the West Bank and until 2005, the Gaza Strip, maintaining that what they called the occupation was a moral stain on Israel, an abdication of the commitment to justice and to internalizing the lessons of the past that the diaspora had imparted upon Jews. And here we see the divergence, not just within Jews, but also very significantly between American Jews and Israeli Jews, that will become more pronounced from this point forward. The latter, Israeli Jews, becoming more conservative, voting repeatedly for right-wing governments, and the former remaining unreconstructed liberals, voting Democratic in American politics, and increasingly critical of Israeli policies, especially amongst younger Jews. And it's that group that leads us to the fourth and final period that I want to discuss tonight. The decade between 2014 and 2024, the last decade. It's in this 10-year period in which we see not only a growing distance between Israeli and American Jews, but also within American Jews. And one marker of this emerges from a comparison of two surveys from the Pew Research Center. So at the beginning of my remarks, I mentioned the 2013 Pew study that showed that nearly 70% of American Jews felt somewhat or very attached to Israel. The 2020 survey reported a 12% drop in attachment among American Jews. And even more prominently, there was a widening gap between older and younger Jews. 67% of those over 65 felt attached, whereas 48% of those under 30 did. So how do we understand this generation gap? One factor, I think, was the cumulative effect of Israel's border wars with Gaza that followed its unilateral withdrawal from that territory in 2005. Since that time, there had been frequent tensions between the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip and Israel. As we now know, Israel believed erroneously that it was perfectly capable of controlling Hamas through periodic military engagements, which it referred to as mowing the grass. The conflict that took place in Gaza in the summer of 2014 followed the brutal murder of 3 Israeli teenage boys who were kidnapped in the West Bank by Hamas terrorists. In retaliation, Israel launched what at the time seemed to be a major attack, both in the air and on the ground. Hamas, meanwhile, continued to launch rockets at Israeli cities and towns. But the loss of life and property was huge at that time. More than 2,000 Palestinians killed, some 70 Israelis, 7,000 houses destroyed, and billions of dollars of damage. Now, for our purposes, one of the most symbolically important developments of this conflict was the arrival on the scene of a group of young American Jews under the banner, "If not now," which harks back to an oft-quoted phrase of the ancient sage Hillel, "Im lo achshav matai." In the midst of hostilities between Israel and Gaza in July, the young Jews of If Not Now began to gather in front of the office of the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations, where they recited the mourner's Kaddish, the mourner's prayer, for both Israeli and Palestinian fatalities. They also took aim against the American Jewish establishment, say as represented by AIPAC, through acts of civil disobedience. They were attempting to disrupt the status quo, apropos Natan's opening statement about disruption. They attempted quite deliberately to disrupt the status quo that they thought was insufficiently attentive to the occupation. And they actually believed that American Jewish institutions were complicit in perpetuating the occupation by not opposing it. They would also voice a critique that became a hallmark of this group and others on that end of the political spectrum, by which I mean they took aim at the education they received in schools, camps, and youth movements. They believed that they had been kind of sold a bill of goods, which is to say, the idea that they inherited was of Israel as a site of great moral virtue, essentially above reproach. And this meant no mention of the occupation, Palestinians, or the Green Line that was often erased in maps of the country. Virtually no mention of the rightward tilt of Israeli politics, especially during the long Netanyahu decade, which is now a decade and a half, from 2009 to 2024. And what I think this reflects in part, the emergence of this group, is really a growing divide between older and younger Jews, between the baby boomer generation and Gen Z, as reflected in a very kind of compelling moral dichotomy. Was Israel to be seen, according to the two biblical prototypes, David or Goliath, either as possessing justice on its side or as perpetrating injustice against another people? Older Jews, and I believe I belong to that category now, who still operated with some memory of the Holocaust, whether they actually lived during that time or they knew survivors as close friends, have felt a very profound sense of existential urgency in defending Israel as a small and beleaguered country facing constant threat. Whereas younger Jews tended to see Israel or often saw Israel as a dominant military power that was subjugating another people. I have to add that this trend and the division that are reflected has been amply commented upon by various scholars and writers. I'm thinking of Peter Beinart in his 2012 book, The Crisis of Zionism. My colleague at UCLA, Dov Waxman in his 2016 book, Trouble in the Tribe, Mira Sucharoff and Aaron Tapper-Hahn in their volume, Social Justice and Israel-Palestine, and Eric Alterman in his 2023 book, We Are Not One. All of these books reflect that awareness of a growing generational divide. So in addition to the Gaza conflicts, I'd highlight three other events that I think have widened the divide between Jews in the United States, defenders, and critics of the state. First, the 2018 nation-state law passed by the Knesset, which asserted that the state of Israel is the national home of the Jewish people, and only Jews have the right to realize self-determination in it. Second, the crisis occasioned by the Knesset elections of November 1st, 2022, when Benjamin Netanyahu, who had been out of office for a year, returned to power as part of a coalition that included far-right religious Zionists, deemed racist extremists by many who were familiar with them. And the subsequent call that emerged out of that new coalition for what was referred to as a judicial reform that, as we know, occasioned 10 months of intense protest by Israelis against that government. And then third, October 7th, 2023, the day of the horrific Hamas massacre in which 1,200 Israelis were murdered mercilessly and more than 200 were kidnapped, which left such a profound visual memory of carnage. The resulting Israeli military campaign that followed produced its own dramatic and quite alternative image: widespread death and destruction as Israel goes about its declared goal of eradicating Hamas. These deep divisions, as reflected in competing images, operate along both generational and ideological lines. I've referred to the generational, but they're also ideological. So just to say a bit more about the generational, there was an oft-quoted New York Times Siena College poll from December that showed that 62% of Americans over 65 support President Biden's embrace of Israel and its path. By contrast, 70% of Americans between 18 and 29 oppose President Biden's policies. And in the same age cohort, 49% believe that Donald Trump would do better in dealing with Israel-Gaza than Joe Biden, as opposed to 30% who thought Joe Biden would do better. This growing chasm and inversion of attitudes also exists along an ideological spectrum between Republicans and Democrats. And it's important to recall that once upon a time, the Democratic Party was far more favorable to Israel than Republicans, who had a very strong isolationist streak in them. This has changed over the course of decades, as numerous surveys show. Most recently in December, Wall Street Journal and Pew, they show that Democrats evince as much sympathy or more with Palestinians and believe that Israel has gone too far in its war with Hamas. Republicans, by contrast, remain overwhelmingly in support of Israeli government policy. What about among Jews? So anecdotally, we hear and see signs of greater solidarity with Israel among American Jews, particularly in the face of the rising tides of anti-Semitism that the Anti-Defamation League has charted. So the ADL, amongst the surveys it has undertaken after October 7th, surveyed Jewish college students in late November and revealed that 73% of them had experienced anti-Semitism after October 7th. So I have some questions about how the ADL counts these instances, but I can report, just on my own experience, that many Jewish students on my campus indeed felt uncomfortable or unsafe during the fall term. My sense is that the fear has somewhat abated. Thank God there was a winter break that had a kind of ameliorating impact. And I think there's also a growing routinization to what's going on in the war. But what is also observable is the growing visibility and numbers of younger Jews who identify with non-Zionist and anti-Zionist movements such as If Not Now and Jewish Voice for Peace, an organization that took rise in 1996, which now claims that it has an email list, and perhaps as a reflection of that, a membership list of 350,000, which is a 9-fold increase from October 4th. And this is the measurement here is the number of newsletters it sent out on the basis of its email list. 9-fold increase from October 4th. The Jewish Voice for Peace holds that Israel is an apartheid regime and should be replaced as a Jewish state by a democratic state of all its citizens. So what I am observing is not only a generational divide among American Jews, but also an intra-generational divide among younger Jews. So on one hand, we have Jews affiliated with, say, Hillel, which they see as a bastion of safety against anti-Semitism, and those who identify with groups like If Not Now and Jewish Voice for Peace, whose supporters see those organizations as bearers of the ethos of Tikkun Olam, repair of the world, precisely by criticizing the state of Israel. I just have to mention another cohort that comes to mind, which is one that I've done some research on and actually some surveying of attitudes along with my colleague Mark Trencher, which is to say Haredi or ultra-Orthodox Jews. There too we see a very interesting generational divide where older Haredim feel deeply identified with Israel. 93% declare that they feel deeply identified with Israel. 64% say they feel more connected after October 7th, whereas we see very different numbers amongst younger Haredim. And I mention that because Haredi Jews already are becoming a much more significant part or portion of the Jewish demographic pie in the United States and elsewhere. Okay, I want to bring this talk to an end by highlighting some of the major conclusions and takeaways. First, I've sought to show that every era surveyed from 1885 onward reveals competing vectors in terms of attitudes about Zionism and Israel, although in different proportions. That is, the proportion between Zionist and non or anti-Zionist sectors varies. Consequently, and second, Zionism and Israel, we can say, have been polarizing issues for American Jews, with relatively few instances of Jews striking a balance between supportive and critical perspectives at the same time. That's a kind of a hard balance to pull off. Ray Ram may have been attempting that. There's an organization today that calls itself the Third Narrative that reflects that. Holding on to a sense of shock and outrage at October 7th, for many, is exclusive of deep concern and shock at Israel's campaign in Gaza, and vice versa. This may be because, third, Zionism and Israel have been perceived to be issues that speak directly to justice, to moral virtue, as I said at the beginning, that serve as a kind of Rorschach test for Jews regarding their own sense of ethics. And that's what makes it hard to bridge the gap between these competing sides. The sense that it's not merely a different perspective, but a difference that cuts to the core of one's identity, of one's sense of what is right and wrong in the world. Fourth, divergences between Jews and others, and among Jews themselves around Israel, have been greatly exacerbated in the age of media fragmentation, and particularly in the era of social media, which encourage people to, first, dwell in isolated silos, and second, to be in conversation with people who inhabit those silos, not with people who exist beyond them. Fifth, American society, the university campus, and Jews in the United States face grave challenges if we remain in these silos. Israel-Palestine, and particularly the post-October 7th iteration of that conflict, is a force multiplier of existing fissures that threaten to make bridge building impossible. And so I'd like to conclude with these thoughts. We must resist the tendency to regard those with whom we disagree as the embodiment of evil in pure ontological terms. I'm not overly hopeful that we can succeed, but I do know, to quote another famous ancient teaching, that we are not at liberty to desist from the task. There are elements of justice and injustice in the Zionist project, and the same holds for Palestinian nationalism. It is important to have the judiciousness and the courage to see this, and to acknowledge that one project has largely achieved its goal and the other remains unrealized. For most of us, grasping that there's truth in both projects requires pushing beyond our own limitations and building up the cognitive and conversational muscle to engage with others. Tonight was an attempt, a first attempt, a working out of some thoughts to lay out some of the historical dynamics and contemporary currents in the American Jewish debate over Israel. And I hope it is the prelude to an animated, engaged, and respectful conversation tonight and well into the future. Thank you very much.